Okay, we're ready to kick off. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gary Mond. I'm chairman of the National Jewish Assembly, and it's my great pleasure to welcome tonight Professor Alan Dershowitz to address us, and he's going to be interviewed by Daniel Berke from the UK Lawyers for Israel. I'm just going to begin by briefly introducing both our speakers, and then I'll hand over to Daniel Berke to conduct the interview. After Professor Dershowitz and Daniel have spoken for about half an hour, I will then invite questions, and please, in asking questions, please raise your virtual hand. Waving your hand in the air is not going to do any good. You must raise your virtual hand. So let me kick off by introducing our speakers. Professor Alan Dershowitz has been teaching, writing, and litigating about law and policy for more than 60 years. He's written 55 books and more than 1,000 articles. Many of today's leaders around the world are among the 10,000 students he's taught, and he's represented and advised presidents, prime ministers, and business leaders all over the world. He's called the world's best-known lawyer and its most prominent defender of civil liberties. He's litigated and won hundreds of cases in multiple countries, and he's received numerous honorary degrees, medals, and other honors for his work. One such honor was bestowed on him by Nobel Peace Prize winner laureate Elie Wiesel, who said, "If there had been a few people like Alan Dershowitz during the 1930s and 1940s, the history of European Jewry might have been different." Most of Professor Dershowitz's cases and causes have been pro bono, including his defense of dissidents such as Anatol Shalansky, Václav Havel, and Julian Assange. Professor Dershowitz graduated first in his class at Yale Law School and was the editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal. He's taught at Harvard for 50 years, where he offered courses in a wide variety of topics. And Professor Dershowitz is going to be interviewed by Daniel Berke, who is a British lawyer specialising in criminal and regulatory law. In his voluntary life, Daniel is the Director of UK Lawyers for Israel, an organisation which uses the law to challenge unfair bias against Israel and supporters of Israel, with a particular interest in supporting students. I have to say UKLFI do absolutely fantastic work. Daniel's a member of the Jewish Diplomatic Corps of the World Jewish Congress as well, and he's worked internationally promoting matters of importance to Jewish communities. Daniel was a founder of the charity Free from Fear, which in the wake of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan saved the lives of a large number of Afghans, mainly women who had risked their lives to try to build a democracy. Since October the 7th, Daniel's joined the advisory board of an Israeli NGO for the survivors and the wounded, supporting survivors of the Nova Festival. Daniel's a founder also of the Militant Expert Panel, which takes high-level veterans from around the world to Israel and into Gaza to better understand the conflict and the challenges that Israel faces. So Daniel, over to you.
Well, thank you. Professor Dershowitz, it's an honour to have you here. Case for Israel was a book that came out while I was at university, and it was a tremendous help, and you're someone that's done so much for international Jewry, so it really is an honour to speak to you today. The question that we're asked to explore is whether President Trump's breaking international law. Now, it's quite a wide question, particularly for somebody like President Trump, who's no stranger to controversy. But given the interests of the audience, we'll primarily be focusing on the war between Israel and Hamas in the context of international law. So recent actions and comments by President Trump have resulted in accusations of breaching international law. I'd like to address these with you. And I think broadly looking at three topics. The first is the sale of weapons to Israel. Secondly, his recent suggestion this month that the US will take over and own the Gaza Strip, and associated allegations that this might include forced displacement. And thirdly, his order to sanction the ICC and Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan, King's Counsel. So dealing firstly with the sale of weapons, he's faced calls that he's facilitating war crimes by lifting the freeze that had been applied by former President Biden to the supply of materiel, including 2,000-pound bombs. We saw the UK government withdrawing licenses for certain materiel on the basis there was, I quote David Lammy, a clear risk that items may be used to commit or facilitate serious violations of international humanitarian law. But the first question I think we'll need to ask when we're addressing this question is whether Israel is conducting this war within the rules of international humanitarian law. I believe it is, but we'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to participate in this event. The work that I know you folks do in England, Lawyers for Israel, are phenomenal. I wish we would have comparable groups in the United States. We're a much more divided Jewish community in the United States than I suspect many diaspora communities around Europe are. First, let's talk about international law. What is international law? International law consists of a great many things. There are treaties, and treaties are contractual and binding. And if a country is a signatory to a treaty, then it's bound by contractual obligations. Israel is not a signatory to the Rome Treaty. It's not a member of the International Criminal Court, neither is the United States. Much of customary international law is merely written by academics in their cloistered ivory towers. And they don't really particularly have any particular force of law jurisprudentially. Law can't be imposed on people unilaterally against their will. And so I want to start with the second question first, because it's much easier for me, and then I'll get to the first question. The question of whether or not Trump or anybody violates international law by proposing that the residents of Gaza be moved. I'm not in favor of that, particularly as a political matter, but as a matter of international law, you have to first ask the question, did Winston Churchill commit war crimes and violate international law along with President Roosevelt and President Truman when they ordered the displacement of 3 million ethnic Germans from Sudetenland, where they had lived since the 11th century? Did Nehru violate international law along with the president of Pakistan when they required millions and millions of Pakistani and Indians to move? Did Arab countries violate international law when they displaced 700,000 Jews, many of them forcibly, at the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the establishment of Israel? Population transfers are as old as populations and as old as history. And the question that I would ask first is a moral question, and that is, without regard to the policy considerations, if by displacing 2 million Palestinians, peace could be achieved in the Middle East in the way that by displacing 3 million ethnic Germans, peace was achieved in Central Europe for many, many years, obviously throughout Europe until the Ukraine invasion recently by Russia. If it could be achieved, would it be a good thing to do? Was the Pakistan Hindu Muslim exchange a good thing? Those are questions that are worth asking, and the question really boils down to what's the alternative. So, from the point of view of international law, obviously it's far better if the population changes are done with a degree of voluntariness, but peace is more important than place. From the beginning of history, populations have moved. And indeed, movement of populations is as constant a historical phenomenon as non-movement of populations. The United States was established by the movement of populations, as was Canada, as was Australia. Those were colonialist efforts. Israel was not established by colonialism. It was established by opposition to colonialism, initially colonialism of the Turks and the Ottoman Empire, and then colonialism of Great Britain and France in establishing the Middle East. After all, look at the Middle East. Who established Syria? Who established Lebanon? Who established Saudi Arabia? These were all colonialist map drawers in Europe that decided that the Hashemite kings of Saudi Arabia should move to Jordan and establish a Hashemite kingdom ruling over Palestinians. So the question of what is international law, is it binding on countries that don't subscribe to it, are extremely, extremely difficult questions. And certainly international law should not be used as a weapon against new ideas. Let the new ideas come out and percolate, and let decisions be made by appropriate authorities as to these new ideas. So now turning to the weapons, the provision of weapons to Israel prevented genocide. Obviously, a disarmed Israel would be an October 7th every day. We know that because Hamas has said that. And it's only Israel's superior arms that provide a guarantee against genocide. You can go back to the Psalms of David, Hashem ozli amo yitain, Hashem yivarechet amo b'shalom. God will give the Jewish people strength, and only then will they have peace. We've learned the lesson of the Holocaust, that the only way Jews can survive, is not only by having morality on their side, but by being stronger than their opponents. And the only way we have any semblance of peace in the Middle East is by Israel having incredible strength. That's why Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, because Israel has the strength to prevent it. That's why Hamas has not repeated October 7th, because Israel has the strength to prevent it. And so, no, Israel is not violating international law. Yeah. And those who say it is are fomenting warfare.
It was interesting that within moments of Trump speaking, President Macron, President Sisi, and of course a panel of experts at the UN, which included the likes of Francesca Albanese, all stepped in to suggest that Israel was breaching international law. They used rather pejorative language, saying it would have devastating consequences for peace and human rights globally and shatter the most fundamental rules of international law. But you make a very good point. And shaking up international order doesn't necessarily mean breaching international law. And if, Einstein was right, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. And what we've had has been war, it's been failure, it's been rockets, it's been kidnappings, it's been murder, and it's been suffering on both sides. Now, forced displacement can technically be a crime, I think, under international law. And the ICRC Customary International Humanitarian Law Database for international and non-international conflicts does say you can't forcibly transfer or order the displacement of a civilian population in whole or in part for reasons related to the conflict unless the security of the civilians involved or the imperative military reasons so demand. But that means for it to be a crime at all, it has to be arbitrary displacement. It's got to have been ordered or committed without grounds, and yet here we have grounds. You mentioned a few very good ones yourself. In addition, I'd say this is post-conflict building. There is the security for the rebuild. There is an exploded ordnance there. There are collapsing buildings. There's population safety during the rebuild, security in ensuring that Hamas is removed, and then the rebuild itself. So the grounds are peace building, humanitarian development, and that's entirely different to forced displacement linked to human rights abuses, such as perhaps the Holodomor in Ukraine, forced labor or genocide. I think it helps if we break down as well for the audience really what President Trump has said, because there's so much disinformation about it, even though what he said can be condensed into a few sheets of A4. Really, allowing the situation to continue for decades, trying and failing at the same thing, countless more deaths, would be an unforgivable failure. But what he's also made clear, really, is that Hamas cannot be involved in any future of Gaza. Israel's degraded them militarily, but it's not destroyed them. This proposal ends their role in Gaza. It makes clear they'll have no role going forward. And if there will ever be a Palestinian state, perhaps after a period of rebuild, investment, and critically denazification, that can't happen with Hamas. So to date, nobody else has actually come up with a plan to remove Hamas from the equation. And whoever takes this on, there's going to be huge rebuild costs, removing explosives, debris, overseeing construction. But what Trump's talking about is creating jobs and wealth and decent housing. But it will require the removal of 1.8 million people. But taking into account the security issues, can't see how they can remain in situ. But what I think is very interesting is under all of this, there is actually a humanitarian aspect that seems to have been ignored. President Trump is actually, for the first time ever, it seems to me, giving Gazans a choice. We will move the population, we will move you into certain areas, you will have good lives there, you will then have the choice whether you come back to the rebuilt Gaza or not. And that's a choice they've never been allowed before, which I think is certainly very interesting. Moving on from the issue around the population, do you think it's lawful for him to simply take Gaza?
No, I don't. I think there are real questions about the power of the United States to simply take over Gaza and put it up for bids to developers as to who could make it a better place. But there are all kind of alternatives. For example, one alternative would be to take half the population of Gaza, say the southern half, and forcibly make them move to the north. Yes, forcibly, because forcible movements of populations should be permitted in the interest of peace if they can be done, and create a better situation. Forcibly remove them for 2 years, then completely clean up the empty south, destroy all the tunnels, build concrete ground so that tunnels couldn't be built, load them with electronics so that there's no possibility of rebuilding the tunnels, rebuild south of Gaza, and then have vetting so that the only people who are allowed back are people who are not in any way connected to Hamas. Then do the same thing in reverse. And over a 4 or 5 or 10-year period, create a new Gaza that would involve the temporary displacement of people for a period of time. Look, the Aswan Dam in Egypt required the displacement of tens and tens of thousands of Egyptians against their will. We've had so many examples of displacement of populations for interests less important than an enduring peace. And so the other point I want to make is please, please, please ignore most international lawyers. You mentioned Alvarez, you mentioned some of the other people. These are people who don't believe in Israel's right to exist. Yeah. Or the 300 idiot rabbis who signed a recent letter in the New York Times. Most of them wouldn't understand what I said when I said Hashem Oz Li'amo Yitain. They have no knowledge of Jewish background. Most of them are Reform rabbis. There are some good Reform rabbis, but many Reform rabbis have been leaders in the anti-Israel movement. And many of these rabbis and many of the people who signed the ad don't believe in Israel's right to exist. Why should anybody take seriously a claim by an alleged international lawyer who doesn't believe that Israel has the right to exist? So you have to be very clear about what you take seriously and what you ignore. Or take Khan. I know Khan, the head of the International Criminal Court. His predecessor, twice removed, is a close friend of mine, and the original founder of the International Criminal Court. And I had a deal with Khan. We had a deal, a personal deal. He was going to come to Israel and he was going to look at the evidence before he made a decision to extend any warrants for arrest. And he was supposed to get there on a Monday. There was an appointment ready to meet with people to give him the information. And his assistant called me on Sunday night and said, for some bizarre reason, he didn't understand it, the Khan has decided not to go to Israel. He's just going to issue the warrants without seeing any of the evidence. Was that because he himself was being subject to accusations of sexual misconduct? I don't know. But I do know that Khan is not a legitimate leader of an international criminal court. And so, although I don't like sanctions, I'm generally opposed to sanctions. I don't believe that the authority of the International Criminal Court should be recognized by countries like Great Britain and France and Italy. They are, unfortunately, Canada, Poland, other countries. I think that the International Criminal Court has become an illegitimate institution, along with the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice was never a legitimate institution. It's not international. Many countries, like Israel, have never been allowed to serve permanently on it for any periods of time. It's not a court because the judges are appointed not on the merits, but by their governments, and they are responsible to their government, report back to their governments. They're not real judges. And they wouldn't recognize justice if they fell over it. Most of their decisions have been extremely unjust. So don't take seriously organizations' names. Amnesty International is an illegitimate organization. Doctors Without Borders is a Hamas front. So just using names of groups and saying they're international lawyers and they're spouting international law should give us no pause. Israel has on its own a far better record in enforcing international law. If you look at Aaron Barak, the former president of Israel's Supreme Court's record on international law, it's far, far superior to that of any international criminal court. So Israel ought to apply international law domestically through its own courts, but ought not to pay attention to institutions that don't believe in its right to exist.
So, Professor Dershowitz, there's a few points you've hit on which I'd like to unpack a little, and I'll start with this. I have a slightly different view on whether or not Trump can simply take over Gaza, but it feeds into one of the issues regarding the legitimacy of the behaviour of the ICC. Gaza isn't a state. It's ungoverned. It has no economy. It's almost entirely reliant on international aid. It's run by an illegal prescribed organisation and subjugates its population. But critically, it doesn't meet any of the criteria of the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States, 1933, as to how states come into being. The criteria are a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. It's simply a failed opportunity. So for the US to go in and rebuild and develop an economy, I'm not sure I accept that it is prohibited, but I think the status is important when we look at the ICC. There are really three issues with the ICC. The first is jurisdiction, and you very much touched on that. Israel wasn't a signatory, although it was involved, as of course, in early negotiations, because Israel and the US saw the benefit of an international court. But when it became clear through perversion of terms from the Fourth Geneva Convention that it was inevitably going to be used against Israel, they backed out. But certainly Palestine, the alleged state of Palestine, ought not to have been a member. But under Fatah Bensouda, the former chief prosecutor, also sanctioned by the US, it was allowed to join, amusingly, on April Fool's Day, I think in 2015. And there is therefore a very, very serious question mark over whether or not there is genuine jurisdiction. I say there isn't. The second point, and you picked up on this, is complementarity, which is the court should act in a way to complement domestic courts and jurisdictions, not to replace them. Israel is a democracy. It's got a well-established and mature legal system with judicial review. There's rule of law. We have a prime minister on trial. We have the former president sent to prison, in fact, by an Arab judge. And soldiers that have acted out with rules of engagement are prosecuted. And there are clear examples of this. Using the terminology of the Rome Statute, Israel has shown it's willing and able. But the ICC refuses to accept that courts within the Jewish state can fairly administer the rule of law. And then the third point, so you've also picked up on, is that it has to be accurate, and it's not. And you mentioned that you're not sure why Karim Khan, King's Counsel, didn't follow through on that trip. I did with my colleague Natasha Hausdorff. We went into Gaza. We saw with our own eyes a huge convoy of aid trucks going in. We saw footage of Hamas booby-trapping almost every single house. Where there weren't booby traps linked to video cameras, so no hope of defusing them, there were weapon stores, or where there weren't weapon stores, there were tunnels, entrances to tunnels, and in some of those tunnels, playing recordings of hostages and booby traps. But he didn't go in there, we did. And it was interesting that he refused to look at or even consider the very, very detailed response by UK Lawyers for Israel, taking apart each and every single sentence, showing that every sentence in the application was false, and providing evidence in support of that. He didn't rely on any information from COGAT. For the audience that don't know, the IDF department that administrates the provision of aid and humanitarian assistance and very carefully records it. He seemingly preferred to rely on information from Hamas rather than figures from the Jewish state. And therefore, on all of those 3 points, on jurisdiction, on compartmentality, and on accuracy, they failed miserably. And whilst none of us like sanctions, it does seem that where every other state has failed to deal with this abuse of law, President Trump does seem to have taken a lead in that.
Look, I agree. I'm not politically. I don't take sides, and I don't disclose who I voted for, as between Trump and Harris in the last election. But I do admire his willingness to think outside the box and to open up new ideas for consideration. Trump is a negotiator. His first ideas are often not the ideas that he ultimately will settle on, and often he overstates his point of view in the beginning. And it took me by surprise when he came out in favor of the plan in Gaza, and I think it took Prime Minister Netanyahu by surprise. I've known Bibi since 1970. I know him very well as a close personal friend, and I could tell by his body language that this was not what he immediately anticipated, but that's Trump for you. He'll shake things up. And the one thing we can't do is allow pundits and Solons and other know-it-alls to tell us what we can think or what we can propose. Maybe in the end, there has to be a consensus as to what will be done, but there certainly doesn't have to be a consensus as to what is legitimately put on the table for discussion. And so I'm personally very pleased that President Trump has put some of these issues on the table. And I hope that they are the beginning of a discussion, not necessarily the end of the discussion. But the most important point I think we have to make and we have to realize is that we live in a world where Israel may have to go to it alone. Right now, it has the support of Donald Trump. But Tom Friedman, the writer from the New York Times, said that Joe Biden is probably the last Democratic candidate to ever be nominated by the Democratic Party who will be pro-Israel. And I think you can say the same about Great Britain. We don't know what the future of Great Britain's relationship is with Israel. It all depends on elections. I guess Spain is probably the primary example of where you have either an extremely pro-Israel or an extremely anti-Israel government, the same in many of the Scandinavian states. I think the point is that Israel must understand that over the next 25, 30, 50, 100 years, Israel will endure forever. But for at least the near term and the middle term, Israel has to be independent. It has to be independent militarily. It has to be independent financially. It has to be independent diplomatically. It has to be independent militarily. Now, that's a very, very hard thing to have in a world that is so interdependent. But Israel is the pariah state. I have a new book coming out called Palestinianism, the Great New Danger to Civil Liberties, Human Rights, and Democracy. This extraordinary focus on only the rights of one country. Nobody cares about the Kurds. Nobody cares about any other group of allegedly displaced people. It's only the Palestinians, and they don't care about the Palestinians. They only care about the fact that the alleged opponents of the Palestinians are the Jews and the nation state of the Jewish people. So international law is part of that. Israel has to develop its own very rigorous approach to international law. It must impose its own rules of engagement, but it must, more importantly, for the survival of the Jewish people, have its own independent military. Yes, it's going to depend on allies. It didn't depend on allies in the 48 War of Independence, barely depended on them in the 1967 war, a little bit more in the 1973 war. But increasingly, Israel has to be ready to go to it alone in every possible respect. It's a tragedy, but it's the way the world treats Israel as the Jew among nations. Anti-Semitism has been the constant since the Bible, since Egypt, since Joseph. The variation came in a 50-year period between 1945 and 95, where there was a kind of golden age of maybe remorse over the Holocaust. But we're now back to the pre-1930 period where the norm is anti-Semitism, the norm is anti-Judaism, the norm is anti-Zionism, the norm is anti-Israelism, and the exception on college campuses, university campuses, international bodies, the media is support for Israel. So we're in a situation where we have to begin to build not only a jurisprudence, but an approach generally to Israel standing alone. Remember, there was a 2,000-year period in Europe where everybody in Europe thought that the Jews killed Jesus, and they were wrong. And the world can be wrong, and Jews can be right, and even if they stand alone. And my dire prediction, I'm 86 years old, so I won't live to see this prediction, but my prediction for my children and my grandchildren is that Israel may be moving toward even greater isolation in the world today. Because if I look at young students at Oxford and at Cambridge and at Harvard and at Yale, I see the future of what Parliament will look like in 20 years, what the American Congress will look like in 20 years. And it's a dire, dire prediction. It's a prediction of Israel go to it alone. Optimism, and when Israel, they say a pessimist is somebody who says, oy vey, things are so bad they can't get worse. And an optimist says, yes, they can. I am both an optimist and a pessimist. Things can get worse. But I do think that Israel and the Jewish community around the world has the strength, has Oz, the strength to fight back and even independently survive and thrive. And just imagine the gift that Israel could give to the world. In 76 years, it's contributed more to the world than any country in the first 76 years of its existence. If it could literally have beaten its swords into plowshares and turned its nuclear weapons into nuclear medicine, can you imagine what a gift it would give to the world? And I think it can continue to do that.
Well, amen. And it's quite remarkable that at a time of war, Jewish people from around the world are moving to Israel and want to be part of it and part of the future and part of the success. Regarding Israel's own jurisprudence, as part of the military expert panel trips that we've taken to Israel, we take senior retired soldiers, including Andrew Fox, but one who came with us, the former deputy commander of NATO, General Sir John McCall. And this is somebody who's fought around the globe over 5 decades. And after traveling to Israel, speaking to senior IDF commanders, traveling into Gaza, and meeting with the IDF legal team, including the head of legal, he actually remarked that Israel's rules of engagement, he described them as exemplary. He wrote in the Times saying that Israel has done all it can to protect civilians in Gaza, and remarked that it was being done in the most complex theatre of war that he's known. And Israel does take this seriously, and anyone that is willing, any real lawyer or anyone who's genuinely interested in human rights, who doesn't just drink the Kool-Aid of Amnesty International and friends, and actually bothers to study this, we'll see that. Before we take questions, because I see a number of hands going up, and I think Gary wanted to leave 20 minutes for questions. Picking up finally on your point about the brief period of sympathy that we felt since the Holocaust and the importance of Israel being strong, being at the cutting edge of everything, and making sure it's a safe and secure and prosperous future for Jews and for all who care to be Israel's friend. It's the words that we've heard so much recently, never again is now. But I think it's important that everybody realizes never again. That's not a plea to other nations. That's our promise. That's our warning. When we say never again, that we mean it. Professor Dershowitz, it's been a pleasure interviewing you. I'm sure we all look forward to your new book. I could see probably about 600 people pre-ordering it in our audience here. But I will hand over now to Gary, because I think there may be quite a lot of questions for you.
Great. Thank you for your great questions and your great conversation. It's a pleasure. And I'm glad you work with Attorney Hausdorff. She's terrific.
She's
And
formidable.
so many great lawyers in England. I just want to say one parting word of pessimism, and that is, the British community, the Jewish community in Britain is divided like every community, but not like in the United States. In the United States, our worst enemies, the worst enemies of Israel and the Jewish people are rabbis, Jews, and prominent intellectuals. I'll give you an example. I am forever banned from speaking at Temple Emmanuel, the largest Reform synagogue in New York. I am forever banned at speaking at the 92nd Street Y, the largest communal place for speakers. They have Peter Beinart speaking all the time against Israel's right to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people. But the Jewish Zionists like myself are banned. I am banned from many Reform synagogues. I cannot speak to them. People forget that when Dreyfus was accused of a crime in France, and obviously Theodore Herzl covered that, people forget one part of the story. Leading Jews in France supported the government's prosecution of Dreyfus. Leading Jews, state Jews, have always been the greatest enemy of the Jewish people. And today in the United States, I can't speak for Great Britain, our greatest enemies are Jews. The editors of the New York Times, the editors of CNN, the rabbis of Temple Emmanuel, and the 92nd Street Y and other Jewish institutions. We have a deep, deep problem of Jewish hatred of Jews and Jewish self-hatred that we have to fight. And our greatest allies today in the United States are Christians and other Zionists who are not Jewish. So let's turn inward a little bit and make sure we focus on our enemies within. There are plenty of them.
100%. And for our audience, there's a book by Ben Freeman, a great educator. He's written 3 books, one on Jewish pride, which is so important. I always get it for young people who are training, and one on internalized hatred, and I highly recommend it. I've been cancelled myself by a couple of members of the House of Lords, because, so I entirely agree. Gary, thank you very much.
Thank you. I would make one small comment of my own, and that is the similarities on what you've just been saying, Professor Dershowitz, between the UK and the US are much greater than you think they are. There are similarities on the role of Jews. They're actually much greater in the just as great in the UK as they are in the US. Now, the first question, before I call questions, I just want to remind everyone who's not a member, please join, because you're going to be missing out in future. It's £18 for life. You just go to www.nja.org.uk, £18 for life. And if you're 30 years old or under, it's only £5 for life.
Well, I'm going to join. Do you have a special tag for people over 85 years old? I will. Sounds like a worthwhile organization.
Thank you very much, Professor Dershowitz. First question is Jonathan Hoffman. Jonathan, please unmute.
Professor Dershowitz, thank you very much. If you check out Lord Hermer, you'll find a Jew in the UK who is exactly how you describe. Unfortunately, he's the Attorney General. My question is as follows, and I'm an economist, so it's really an economics question, but I'm sure you can give a really great answer. To rebuild Gaza in the way that President Trump is indicating is going to cost billions of dollars. We're seeing Trump wanting to withdraw from America from things happening abroad, primarily from Ukraine. Does President Trump really intend to spend, and Congress as well, to spend US dollars on rebuilding Gaza with the help possibly of Saudi Arabia, with the help possibly of Jordan? Is this a viable budgetary layout for President Trump? Thank you. And Congress as well.
A great question. My grandmother used to always talk about Yemen's guilt, other people's money. And that's what Trump believes in. Trump believes that Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar and other countries can bear the heavy burden of rebuilding Gaza. But I do think that whatever the cost is, it will be worth it if it can be rebuilt in the right way. People say you can't defeat an ideology. Well, Britain and the United States defeated Nazism. They defeated the ideology. There's still some Nazis in Germany, but they don't have the military resources to back them up. And I think the same thing would be true in both the West Bank, Yehuda and Sharon, as well as in the Gaza Strip. If we can destroy Hamas, we can defeat the ideology, particularly if we create a Marshall Plan. And that is essentially what I think President Trump had in mind. He didn't use the term, but I think the idea of rebuilding Gaza in a way that presents the citizens of Gaza, the residents, the Palestinians, with an option of peace. Right now, they have no option of peace. Their only option is terrorism and war. And university students at Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard are encouraging them to revolution and intifada. They need alternatives. And I think a Marshall Plan of the kind that can derive from President Trump's idea would be a very good way of having an economic solution to what is a complex and difficult problem. So thanks for your great question.
Thank you. Peter Baum.
Mr. Dershowitz, thank you very much. I have in front of me a book by the late Howard Grief, The Legal Foundation and Borders of Israel Under International Law. And he summarizes by suggesting that both Gaza and Judea and Samaria, under immutable international law, are within Israel's sovereign territory. He cites the League of Nations mandate of 1922-23, supported by a UN Charter, Article 80, and three international legally binding principles of acquired rights, estoppel and uti possidetis juris. Forgive me if I haven't pronounced the latter two correctly. Is it your understanding that under international law, both Gaza and Judea and Samaria are within Israel's sovereign territory?
Well, he's not the only person to make that argument. The former dean of the Yale Law School and Assistant Secretary of State Eugene Rostow made similar arguments after 1967. I was honored in 1967 to work with Justice Arthur Goldberg, who was then the permanent representative to the UN, on Resolution 242 of the United Nations, which was essentially the peace treaty following the 1967 war. You can make all kinds of claims under international law of Israel's sovereignty. You can also make claims that Gaza has no status. After all, what is Gaza? It never has been a unit of any country. It was offered to the Egyptians during the Camp David negotiations with President Carter, and Egyptians said, we don't want any part of it. And by the way, the myth that the people who live in Gaza today are descendants of people who were forced out of Israel is just demographically untrue. A very, very substantial portion of them come from Egypt, the way Yasser Arafat did. And others, they're Egyptian by origin. Many of the Palestinians on the West Bank today are, in the words of the Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Southern Syrians or Jordanians. You can make all those arguments, but what's needed in the Middle East is a pragmatic solution, not a legal solution, and not a religious solution, a pragmatic solution. And it's been very hard to come by. What is an appropriate pragmatic solution? How does it look forward? Again, you can make all kinds of arguments after the Second World War. Did Silesia belong to Poland or to Germany? Did Alsatia? Where about this? What about Stalingrad? Not Stalingrad, Königsberg. We have to look realistically at what the current situation is. And the current situation is right now, there is no perfect solution. And what is needed is a compromise. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has said over and over again that a compromise will require painful compromises on all sides. And I think that's true. I think it will require compromises in claims of international law, compromises in claims of religious law, compromises in claims of rules of demography. And what we're looking for is a solution that is the least worst and one that promotes the prospects for the kind of peace that has endured through Europe between the end of the Second World War and the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I'm hoping that, you know, lawyers can play something of a role in that, economists can play something of a role in that, and all kinds of leaders can play a role in that. But what's needed is a pragmatic solution to a complex and difficult problem. And I think President Trump's ideas contribute to that solution.
Gary, if I may just, briefly add to that. On October the 8th or 9th, there was a rally in Manchester, a vigil. A well-meaning but entirely misguided politician came along and spoke to the audience and said what we need is a two-state solution, increasingly being called the two-state delusion. Because if madness is trying the same thing again and again and again and getting the same results. And pragmatism is the key. And the danger is, and it's why people in this audience and in the pro-Zionist sector need to be so robust and clear and show such clarity on this. Too often in the West, we're seeing leaders clinging to something that's failed time and time and time again. And invariably, they have absolutely zero understanding of the historical issues, the tribal issues, the religious issues, the security issues, the geographical issues, which have made this fail so many times. And when proposals are put forward, and there will of course be pain on both sides, they need to be looked at carefully, because what we can't do is keep doing something that has repeatedly failed. It's dangerous.
I agree, but the failure was one-sided. One must look at what President Clinton said in both October and December of 2024. And he went to Michigan, the heart of Palestinian, Arab, anti-Israel populations. He went there and he spoke to an Arab audience, and he said to them, how many of you realize that what Israel offered when he was president, 2000, 2001, 96% of the West Bank, 4 to 5% of Israel, which would have given them about 101% of what they currently have, 100% of the Gaza, a capital in Jerusalem, a symbolic right of return, everything they could possibly want. And Arafat not only said no, but responded by an intifada, killing 1,000 Israelis and 3,000 Palestinians. And then he said in December, don't expect a state. If you turned it down 25 years ago, you don't come back and say do-over. Things have changed. It is 100%, not 99%, 100% the fault of the Palestinian leaders that there is no Palestinian state. They could have had a state under the Peel Commission in 1937, 1938. They could have had one under the UN partition, 1947, 1948. They could have had one under Resolution 242, which I helped to draft in 1967. They could have had it under the Oslo Accords. They could have had it under the Barak parameters. Even more recently, under the Ehud Olmert, they would have gotten even more. And the Palestinians have not only said no, 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 no negotiation, no recognition, no peace, but they have always responded by violence and intifada. The Palestinians do not deserve a state. The Kurds deserve a state. The Palestinians do not deserve a state. The real question is, does Israel deserve for there to be some kind of a Palestinian state, disarmed, at peace, that would create a good divorce rather than a bad marriage? That's the question. The moral question is not what do the Palestinians deserve? They deserve nothing. The question is, what do the Israelis deserve in terms of maximizing the prospects for peace over the next century?
Thank you. We're very honoured to have Baroness Ruth Deach with us this evening. Baroness Deach.
Alan, I am your biggest fan. You are a hero to the Jews of the world.
We have a mutual admiration society. Thank you.
But you say it like it is. There's been mention of failures. I put it to you, there are two big failures. One is UNRWA, UNRWA is the problem, not the solution.
Right.
And the second is our young people. It's worse with the young people. Yet in this country, Holocaust education is compulsory. And I'm sure you in the States, like us, spend millions on the Holocaust remembrance museums and so on. What's gone wrong with Holocaust education?
Well, first of all, a young woman wrote a great book recently called Everybody Loves Dead Jews. And it's about Holocaust museums. And it's about thinking of Judaism in terms of only the tragedies of Judaism. I'd rather see museums involved with the creation of the State of Israel and Israel's contribution to the world and the contributions of Jews to the world, to Great Britain, to the United States, to all over the world. So Holocaust education looks backward and is an important component of anybody's education, whether they're Jewish or not. But it hasn't been the success that people, I think, hope for. In terms of UNRWA, UNRWA is a disaster. It is the problem. Every other immigrant group, every other refugee group is assimilated. The goal of UNRWA is to keep refugees terrorists, make them fester in the past again, and talk about the Nakba. That's all they talk about is the Nakba, as if Israel had anything to do with the Nakba. The Nakba never would have occurred had all the Arab armies not invaded Israel and tried to destroy it at its birth. Had Ben Gurion's model been accepted, we'd have today one state where many Palestinians, Arabs would live in peace with Israel. There would be more of them, and there would be demographic fights and arguments, but there wouldn't have been a refugee problem. So, it's the selective look at the past, which is our problem. I think there's too much focus on the past, both by Palestinians looking at Nakba and by Israel looking at the Holocaust. And I think what we have to do is build on the past, but create a future where young Jews are proud of what the Jews have accomplished and will accomplish in the future. And I don't think Jewish education, either in Great Britain or in the United States, is up to the challenges of our future.
Joseph Mintz.
Thank you for the presentation, Professor Dershowitz. I wanted to come back to the issue of the enemy within, so to speak. I'm also an academic. I'm a professor of education at University College London, and I certainly see how there are many Jews within the academy who are violently opposed both to Israel and to Jews. And I think that does have legal consequences because, as you say, these will be the judges and the senators of the future. But I think there's also concern that within the Jewish community leadership within the UK, that there are in fact many people who are signed up in many ways to the progressivist critique of Israel and Jews, and we've seen that very much since it's come into sharp relief since October 7th. And that's as well been going on in the US, for example. We've seen that both particularly before October 7th with organizations such as the ADL. But at the same time, I think there's kind of a desire that we still, as a broad community, can preserve a form of political neutrality where we're able to have relationships with political organizations and political parties, both on the left and the right. But that seems something that's increasingly difficult to do. And I just wondered whether you had any solutions or thoughts around that.
Well, it's a great question. And first, in order to come up with solutions, you have to understand why this happened. I'm old enough. I grew up at a time when every left-wing organization in the United States, the National Lawyers Guild, the American Communist Party, the American Socialist Party, were fervently anti-Zionist. You could rarely go to a meeting of the left where they didn't sing Tzena, 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 and they didn't sing Hava Nagila, and they didn't sing Israeli songs. Every folk singer loved Israel. Every left-wing young woman went to a kibbutz to work. Israel was the paradigm of socialism and of progressivism and of the left. And then something happened. And you know what happened? People forget about this. The Soviet Union changed its policy toward Israel. In the early 1960s, the Comintern changed its policies. They made a realization. Arabs had oil, Israel had sand. Arabs had the Suez Canal. The Jews, Israel had a bad location. They made a calculated decision to turn against Israel. And the American and British left turned on a dime. Nobody thought about it. Suddenly, the people who were singing Tena, Tena, Tena were singing pro-Palestinian songs. Suddenly, the people who started to work on kibbutzim began to work in Palestinian villages. It had nothing to do with ideology. It had everything to do with following the Soviet Union. That's what it was about. And that hasn't changed. Noam Chomsky was my camp counselor in a Hebrew-speaking Zionist camp called Camp Masad in 1948. And he was very pro-Zionist, sure, a Shomer HaTzair Zionist, a left-wing Zionist, but a very strong Zionist. Then he, obviously, when the Soviet Union changed, he changed. William Kunstler changed. Norman Finkelstein changed. They all changed. They changed simply because they were fellow travelers of the Soviet Union. And it was the change of communism that brought about the change in attitudes toward Israel. These young people don't know that. They think that somehow there's something inherent about progressivism and the left and anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism, which is anti-Israel. You know, they don't realize that Jordan is a creature of colonialism, Syria is a creation of culturalism, Iraq is a creation of colonialism. It's just total historic ignorance. And it's so important to try to change that education. When I speak at university campuses, and I ask how many people know that Clinton and Barack offered the Palestinians a state, you get 1,000 people in the audience and 4 people raise their hands and they're all wearing kippas. Nobody else seems to understand the history. And we've done an inadequate job in presenting the historical background and the realities of what the Palestinians have been offered and what they've turned down. And I hope that together we can create a much better educational experience starting in elementary school for our students to help them understand the realities, how we got to where we are. What's the solution? The solution is, you know, it's so interesting. When you go to college campuses today, you see 3 groups. You see a virulent anti-Israel group consisting largely of Muslims, but also of progressive left-wingers. They can't be changed. And you see very, very strong pro-Israel groups, kids with kippot wearing that sit outside, wearing, you know, Zionist garb, and they are terrific, and you're not going to change them. And then you have that large middle that just wants to be accepted and be friendly, and we're losing that large middle to the sexier and more acceptable left wing, and that's where we have to focus our attention.
Judith Adder, are you there? Judith? No, I can't hear you. Therese, got your hand up?
I'm unmuting. Sorry about the picture. I've just unpacked the computer. It's brand new. I haven't got all the settings. But perhaps someone should remind the Jews who are the human shields for the anti-Zionists that this path has been trodden before. There were, for instance, German First World War I veterans who were supporters of the Nazis for quite some time and who ended up in the same places that other Jews did, sometimes taking their medals to the gas chambers. But whereas they are quite dispiriting to think about, I'm wondering if you have any optimism coming from the young and youngish modernizing Arabs, and a few other people like that. There's currently a tour in the UK by Ed Hussein, who is originally from Britain, now lives in the US, Amjad Taha from the UAE, and there are other people who are speaking up, like Louay Al-Sharif, Noor Dari in this country, Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, who all seem to be quite happy for Israel to exist, and very often are speaking up against the woke, against the anti-Zionist. So do you think there are some little shoots of hope in the modernizing Arabs and Muslims?
I do. And I have a personal experience with this. Some of you may know this, that there was a Pakistani man from Great Britain who was determined to blow himself up as a shaheed, and he was going to go to Israel and plant bombs and kill himself. And he decided before he would do that, he'd like to learn a little bit about what he was doing. So he went to the Waterstone bookstore, and on the remainder table for $1, he bought a copy of my book, The Case for Israel, thinking he'd read it and throw it in the garbage pail. And he read it and he said, wow, I didn't know these things. And he went to Israel and he became a Muslim Zionist. He now travels all over the world as a Muslim supporting Zionism and Israel. I'm not suggesting that books are going to change the dynamics. But look, if I were 26 years old, I'd be volunteering to fight in Gaza. I'm 86 years old and my only weapon is my pen. I don't even own a computer. So I write by hand, and I will continue writing as long as the good Lord gives me the power to do that and continue to speak. That's all we can do. Each of us can do what we can do. Those who have access to writing op-eds should do it. Those who have access to meeting with young Muslims and trying to persuade them should do it. But nobody should remain silent. Nobody should remain passive. We are living at a time of crisis. It's interesting. This book I wrote a pamphlet. We printed 1 million copies to be distributed at 1,000 colleges and universities. By the way, if anybody wants free copies, we're doing it free for any British university. Just write to my publisher at Skyhorse, and you can get as many copies as you want to distribute free. But the back of the book is a message to young defenders of Israel. And I say, you are a fortunate generation, far more fortunate than previous generations who were not in a position to defend Israel and the Jewish community against anti-Semitism, etc. In the 1930s, you couldn't speak out. Today, young people can speak out. And so that's why I've decided to write this pamphlet. My next pamphlet is about Palestinianism. We're planning a series of 10 pamphlets to be given out on college campuses. The reason I wrote it as a pamphlet, I want it to be small enough to fit into somebody's pocket so they can carry it around with them and use it as a source. And again, it's available free to any British university. For those of you who want to buy it, it's a few bucks on Amazon, but you can get them free for anybody. And so everybody should do what they can do to make the case for Israel and to make the case for Zionism. I'm not saying to make the case for Likud. I'm not saying to make the case for Netanyahu. I'm not saying to make the case for Smotrich or Ben-Gvir. Indeed, I have one proposal that I've been making to Israel now for 20 years, and it hasn't been accepted. Maybe you can help me get it accepted. I don't think that Israel Hasbara, that is Israel public diplomacy, should be in the government. It should be in the president's office. It should be Hasbara on behalf of the state of Israel, on behalf of the president who represents the state of Israel, not on behalf of any political party. It should never be designed to help one party stay in power or the other party to gain power. And I think Israel could do a better job of public diplomacy if it limits its diplomacy to support for the consensus in Israel rather than any partisanship within Israel.
Okay, Andrew McCutcheon is next. Andrew.
Professor Dershowitz, thank you very much for that talk. I want to bring you back to some comments you made earlier about the cost of rebuilding Gaza and what should the goals of any rebuilding be. Put this in context with my background. My first visit to Israel was 48 years ago, the spring of 1977 when I was in my final year studying medicine. And I spent 8 weeks at an American-run hospital in Gaza City. 1/3 of the staff were Americans, 2/3 were local people. And I had the privilege of having meals at a farm belonging to one of those families. And I've subsequently been to 5 medical conferences in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Now, question is really the goal. What should be the goal in, quotes, rebuilding Gaza? And I'm troubled when I read Zephaniah chapter 2, where it says, the sea coast shall be pastures with shelters for shepherds, flocks for folds. The coast shall be for the remnant of the house of Judah. There's nothing in there. I've done a word search in scripture, cannot find anything about Gaza being rebuilt. There's just plenty about it being destroyed. So is it just going to be agricultural?
Well, you may know that following the Second World War, one of the great Americans, the only Jew in President Roosevelt's cabinet, a man named Morgenthau, proposed that for Germany, there not be a Marshall Plan. He opposed the Marshall Plan. He said Germany ought to be turned into an agrarian society. All concert halls ought to be closed for the next 50 years. All art museums ought to be closed. No German should be allowed to be, in the next 50 years, be wealthy or successful. The country ought to be punished for what it did to the world. 50 million people murdered, 6 million of them Jews murdered in cold blood. That plan was rejected in favor of the Marshall Plan. So Hitler's prophecy came true. Hitler said, if you kill the Jews of Germany, the rest of Germany will be better off. And that turned out to be true. They killed the Jews of Germany and Germany was better off. So the Marshall Plan was a moral disgrace and yet a pragmatic success. We live in a world where morality and pragmatism don't always coincide. We compromise morality, we achieve success against communism. The Morgenthau Plan would have been moral, but it would have turned Germany toward the Soviet Union. So there's no free lunch. Life is complex and choices are complex. And there's no perfect solution for Gaza. The perfect solution would have been the one that Menachem Begin proposed at Camp David, where he said Egypt ought to take over the Gaza Strip, as it did. Remember, in 1948, when Israel was established, the first thing that happened is that Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip and Jordan occupied the West Bank. And they became outdoor prisons for those 20 years between 48 and 67. But the world didn't care. Nobody cared. The Palestinians could have had a state in Gaza if they had asked Egypt for it or asked Jordan for it on the West Bank. It's only when Israel got control of those two areas that the quest for statehood became part of an international community. So, these are such complex issues. And again, what I'm looking for is a pragmatic solution. I'm a criminal lawyer, and I tell my clients all the time, my job is not to get you from good to better to best. That's not in the nature of things, because most of my clients are guilty. Thank God most of my clients are guilty. You wouldn't want to live in a country where most people charged with crime are innocent. That might be China and Iran. It's not Great Britain. It's not the United States. So any barrister who tells you that most of his clients are innocent either picks his clients very carefully or is lying to you, probably the latter. And so I tell that to my clients. I'm not trying to get you good, better, best. I'm trying to get you from not so bad to away from even worse and away from worser. And if I can get up to not so bad, it's a pretty good solution for you. And I think the same thing is true in the Middle East. We can't be seeking a perfect solution. There is no perfect utopian solution in the Middle East, but there are bad solutions and worse solutions. And right now, on October 6th, we were in the worst solution. We had ceasefires in Gaza. We had a ceasefire in Lebanon. And look what happened on October 7th. So we're looking to improve that. And I think any plan that promises significant improvement from the status quo is one that we should consider.
Professor Dershowitz, are you happy to give us another 10 minutes or are you...
Yes, the questions have been great. And I always enjoy getting together with my British sisters and brothers. And so, of course, taking minutes. Yeah.
We've got about 7 more questions. Let's see how many we get.
Can I just say thank you for that. We just have to wait and see what will happen and pray for the safety of those who have to dispose of all the remaining munitions.
I agree.
Thank you. Benjamin Tamba. Benjamin.
Tangerine.
Oh, sorry.
Or even an orange.
You unmute yourself, Benjamin. You're on mute. Can you unmute?
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much. I have to say, I've met many Jews and I'm proud of you. Your lectures has been amazing. I'm a proud Trump supporter as well. I think what Trump is saying is right. You have to take over Gaza. The Germans, they work for the Germans. Today, they make cars. They don't make Luftwaffes to bomb Britain. They make beautiful cars for us here in Britain. We drive their Mercedes. We've groomed their mind back to civilization. The only thing I want to ask you is, how about the Sinai? Israel once took over the Sinai and they gave it back to Egypt. How about expanding a bit of the Sinai, add it to the Gaza, and then move all the Palestinians from the West Bank there? Because one thing we know, we cannot allow what happened in October 7 to happen again. So how about America actually pressing on by taking some huge part of the Sinai and then move all the Palestinians and turn Gaza, like Trump said, to a Riviera. You can come back and party as long as you have no mission to attack Israel. The Palestinians can always come back in there and enjoy themselves, but it will be a Riviera, I can promise you that. The Trump group, we want to turn that place to a happy place, not a place where you can practice terrorism. So how about the Sinai? America take a piece of the Sinai, and American military stays there.
Everybody would accept it except the Egyptians. The Egyptians, the last thing they want in the world is 4 or 5 million Palestinians living in the Sinai, and the possibility of terrorism. We already have terrorism in the Sinai.
They will have factories. They will have factories. They will have better future. They will have universities. They will have companies. The Germans were Nazis before. Remember, they don't practice Nazism anymore.
They're great utopian solutions. I'm prepared to consider any solution that results in a peaceful Palestinian population. Look, the Palestinian people have generally been very, very productive, very innovative, very energetic.
Sorry.
Could we mute, please?
Palestinians have lacked has been decent leadership. And by the way, it was largely the fault of a British Jew. A British Jew named Samuels was appointed to be the czar, the high commissioner of what was then called the mandate. And what did that idiot do? Is he decided that he would negotiate with the leader of the Palestinian people, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who never would have accepted Israel on Islamic grounds. And so, it was Samuels who really was the cause of the problem. He turned what was a land dispute, which was resolvable. Certainly, a real estate dispute would have been easily resolvable by Donald Trump. But Samuels turned it into an irresolvable religious dispute by picking the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who immediately responded by murdering Jews at Hebron in 1929. There couldn't have been a worse judgment at all than the Jewish Samuels picking the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem to head the Palestinian people. That was really the major cause of what has turned what would otherwise have been a resolvable boundary dispute into an irresolvable religious dispute. So curse Samuels.
Thank you. Les Bloom.
Oh, hi. Okay, I'm going to ask a very, very quick question in 10 seconds time. But just before I say that, the irony of what people accuse Israel of as being a terrorist state has been going around the world for the last 20 odd years. And the crazy thing is that Israel is clearly not a terrorist state, absolutely very productive and contributes to lots of things around the world, whereas Gaza has contributed absolutely nothing and is a terrorist state. All it does is build tunnels and fire rockets. But anyway, my quick question, why do so many people around the world support Hamas?
Oh, I don't think they support Hamas. I think they hate Jews.
Okay.
Hamas was fighting Turkey, or Hamas as it would, because it's really the Muslim Brotherhood. But if Hamas would limit itself to fighting against Arab leaders, nobody would care. The only reason people support Hamas is because the alleged enemy of Hamas is Jews. So the Palestinians are the luckiest people in the world that their perceived enemy are Jews. If their perceived enemy wouldn't be Jews, they'd be the Kurds. Remember, the Kurds, there are many more Kurds than there are Palestinians. They have a separate language, partly, separate culture, separate everything. There are many more of them. There was a Treaty of Severities which promised them a nation inside of Turkey. But nobody has ever seen a demonstration on behalf of the Kurds. Has any Oxford student even heard of the Kurds? Has any Cambridge student ever demonstrated on behalf of the Kurds? No. It has nothing to do with the Palestinians. It only has to do with the fact that the alleged oppressor of the Palestinians are the Jews and the Jews among nations, namely the nation state of the Jewish people. This is purely a manifestation of international anti-Semitism. It's as simple as that.
Michael Goldberg, if you're happy to, can you turn your camera on?
It's not Michael, it's Sharon, his wife. Hi, Gary.
Hi.
Sorry, my camera's not working on this particular computer. We mentioned rebuilding of Gaza. The problem is that from what I understand, Bibi was sending loads and loads of money across to Hamas via the Qataris, and all of this money went into building tunnels, which we all know about. So money is not the issue in Gaza. The problem is how it's being put to use, and I don't see that being resolved anytime soon. The second problem that I'm seeing is just one second thing. Since the Jabalaya agreement and previous to that, Israel has always been more willing to give more Palestinians back for each person taken that's been Israeli or Jewish. Now, that has taught them the one thing that they can do is you take an Israeli, you'll get 1,000 Palestinians out of Israeli jails. So this is a continued story. How do we work with that? What is Israel wrong to give this many people back?
Of course it is, and it's wrong to give a single person back. And Benjamin Netanyahu was right back then in the 1980s when he said Israel should never negotiate with terrorists, should never give up a single, should ever make a single decision based on extortion. Remember the deal between Israel to return maybe 6 hostages this Saturday in exchange for another several hundred. It's not a deal, it's an extortion. It's that Israel values human life more than the Palestinian leadership values human life, and therefore they can be extorted into doing what happened with Galit Shalit, of course, where they gave up 900 or so Palestinians, including Sinwar, for one Israeli soldier. I know I was in the prime minister's house when the Shalit's family and friends were crying outside and demanding it. You know, Israel has a heart and its leaders have hearts. And so they're prepared to give up multiple numbers of Palestinians, including cold-blooded murderers, in exchange for one individual or 10 individuals or 6 individuals. Of course it's not right. Of course it's not fair. And if we could start from scratch, and if every country in the world would agree that you never negotiate with terrorists, there wouldn't be hostages and there wouldn't be the kinds of extortion that we're seeing. But every country has given in. You know, we're now watched on television a new movie based on what happened in Munich some years ago. And of course, it didn't show what happened afterward. The Palestinians who were arrested after killing all the Israelis in Munich were immediately released in exchange for a fake hijacking. And every country in the world, Britain as well, gave up hostages gave up people and made concessions based on hostages. And so, you know, the Hamas and other terrorist groups understand the vulnerabilities of decent democracies. Decent democracies care about their people. Sinwar, on the other hand, in the last statement he made before he was killed, said he praised the people who were being used as human shields, that every time Israel kills a civilian, it's a benefit to Hamas, and therefore these people should be encouraged to give up their lives. They called it the CNN strategy. The more dead babies, the more CNN shows it. If it bleeds, it leads. And I call it the dead baby strategy. It's a strategy in which people like Sinwar are prepared to sacrifice babies. In this case, tomorrow, we're going to see the return of 2 dead Israeli babies. But the Palestinian leadership, the Gaza leadership, Hamas leadership, uses Palestinian babies as fodder for anti-Israel propaganda, because every time a baby dies and is shown on CNN, Israel loses support. And so it's part of the strategy, and it's a mistake that Israel made 25, 30, 50 years ago. And I don't know how it's ever going to get out of that mistake again, because, there'll be more hostages taken over the years, because every time a hostage is taken, Hamas benefits.
Cynthia Wilson.
Thank you so much for your amazing talk. And I realize you're talking as a lawyer about practical solutions. However, the fascinating thing about Israel is that it is a spiritual matter as well as being a pragmatic political matter. And I, as a committed Christian, one of the problems I see about perception and blindness is replacement theology, which has infected the Gentile church forever. And that stops any recognition of the place of Israel in understanding the word of God. And I would just like to ask you, would you have any time for listening? Do your politicians listen to committed Christians and their advice in terms of trying to find a way through the very real problems on the ground?
Yes. And I think, first of all, Israelis were the first to recognize this, but I think diaspora Jews in England and the United States now recognize it more. Alliances with Christian Zionists are crucially important. I remember 25 years ago, people saying to me, oh, the Christian Zionists, they're just interested in making sure that they support Israel so that they can convert Jews to Christianity. No, that's not true. The Christian Zionists I know have a deep place in their heart. I met a couple recently who said to me, there are only 2 countries I would die for. One, the United States, they were Americans, and the other, Israel. I have many, my friends include Mike Pompeo and Mike Huckabee and other great Christian friends of Israel. And as far as replacement theology, of course, the Catholic Church has now rejected that and has said that Christianity didn't replace Judaism. Christianity was an outgrowth of Judaism. They are our older brothers, etc. We're seeing theological revisions within Christianity, and I think part of it results from the tremendous love that many Christians have toward Israel, and they see Israel as authentic and not as necessarily a punishment for the rejection of their Savior, but as a redemption. And so I think that it's so important to continue to work together with Christians and with Christian Zionists and with Muslim Zionists, if possible, too. Israel has to form the greatest coalition. And I was hoping that the Abraham Accords, of course, wonderful name, Abraham, because Abraham is a patriarch of Christianity, of Islam, and of Judaism, could help bring about that resolution. But in the meantime, Christian friends of Israel cannot be taken for granted, must be welcomed and accepted in every possible way. And just, you don't speak for all Christians, but I want to thank you on behalf of, I don't speak for all Jews, on behalf of your friendship toward Israel and the friendship of real Christians toward the real Jewish state. So thank you.
Sheldon Stone, and it'd be nice if you could turn your camera on so we can see you. Sheldon Stone. Sheldon, are you there? You are
Yes,
there.
I'm here. Have I now turned my camera on?
Lovely.
Is my camera on? I'm not
Yes,
sure I'm worth
we can
looking
see
at.
you, we can see you.
Thank you very much for the lecture and the ensuing discussion. I want to come back to what the legal position of Trump's suggestion of displacement is, but I want to preface it by saying that I think if we can rebuild Gaza within the framework of the Abraham Accords, and this is buttressed by the Saudi normalization, and there is removal of Hamas, whom incidentally only 6% of the Palestinian population in Gaza, by the latest poll by Arwad, favor continuing in government. That would be the best. That would be the best option, and may or may not be feasible. But I just want to clarify what the actual law says. I'm looking at Rule 129.
Of what? Rule?
The ICRC.
129 of the ICRC.
Okay.
Of the ICRC. And it's quite clear that there is some flexibility here. Parties to an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict may not order the displacement of the population unless the security of the civilians is involved or imperative military reasons so demand. And this is where you could make the argument that for peace one can displace. What is confusing me is that the Fourth Geneva Convention, and it's referring to Article 49, says you may not displace outside the bounds of the occupied territory, except for where, for material reasons, it's impossible to avoid such displacement. But when I actually look at Article 49, it has a blanket statement against such deportations. They say they are prohibited regardless of their motive. So on a point of law, I'm not quite sure what practice of Rule 129 is actually saying.
The first question,
my confusion.
Who were you saying is in occupation of Gaza? Israel left Gaza when the Jewish population of Gaza was forcibly removed.
No, it's saying outside. I'm talking about transferring outside the territory.
Sorry,
Article 49. Individual or mass forcible.
Are you suggesting that Israel's in occupation of Gaza?
Individual or mass forcible transfers from occupied territory to the territory of the occupying power or to that of any other country, occupied or not, are prohibited.
But who's the occupying power?
I think that's my question. I don't believe there is an occupying power. Jews were removed forcibly from Gaza in 2006, and Hamas has been the power in Gaza. It isn't actually a state. I go back to that point as well. But Israel at the moment is not in occupation. There is a war, and Israel's made it clear it doesn't intend to have a permanent presence. So the 129 of the customary international humanitarian law database clarifies this, saying it can't deport or transfer forcibly unless the security of civilians involved or there's an imperative military reason which demands it. I think there is.
Okay, can we move on now to the next question? Barry Searle. Barry Searle, can you unmute? And preferably, if possible, can we see you with your camera on?
My camera's not working, Gary. I'm so sorry.
Don't worry, Barry. Ask your question.
Okay. So, Professor Dershowitz, if I made it to 86, I hope to be like you. This is my question. What has happened, do you think, to Israeli international diplomacy? Has it failed? And if so, why?
No, it hasn't failed. Israel's international diplomacy is an impossible job to do when you have countries like the Scandinavian countries taking the attitudes they take toward Israel or some of the other countries. Being a diplomat in those countries is an impossible job, and many of the diplomats have done as good as they can possibly do. So I don't believe that Israel has engaged in diplomatic failures. It's engaged in diplomatic challenges, and those challenges have been met as well as possible. The realities of the world and the realities of the world that the nation state of the Jewish people is becoming more and more of a pariah, particularly among young progressives, and it goes beyond diplomacy. It goes beyond and it goes to geopolitics and domestic politics, and it's extraordinarily complex. But I've never been one who blamed either Israeli public diplomacy or Israeli diplomatic efforts for the situation that Israel finds itself in. It indeed, diplomats and and remember, again, the Israeli press, there is more anti-Israel press in the world than Haaretz. I mean, you need Al Jazeera. If you want to have anti-Israel press, just open up and read Haaretz. You want to come to the United States and read anti-Israel press, read the Forward. Israelis and Jews are the worst when it comes to media relationships. The New York Times, owned by a Jew, CNN, run by a Jew, and all these, Haaretz has never, it has not only Trump derangement syndrome, but Netanyahu derangement syndrome. There's nothing either of those leaders could do that would ever satisfy the hard left anti-Jewish media that are reflected by our and the Forward and other organizations. And the same thing is true of diplomacy. When you have to have diplomacy with countries that are automatically knee-jerk anti-Israel, it's an impossible job, and Israel does the best it can. So I'm not going to fault the diplomats, and I'm not going to fault the public relations of Israel. I'm going to fault those who won't have a single objective stand in which they judge the nation state of the Jewish people.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask our Managing Director, Steve Winston, to propose a vote of thanks. And my apologies to David, James and Philip that there isn't time for questions. Steve.
Well, Professor Dershowitz, what to say? I remember being a fresh-faced 20-year-old when I saw a movie on TV, Reversal of Fortune, all about a fantastic lawyer and the Sonny Bambulo case. And I remember being delighted some years later when I saw that very same lawyer authored the book that really solidified all my childhood Zionist education, The Case for Israel. And it's a book I still refer to this day. So thank you for that. But back to this evening. You've really shared, obviously, you've shared some very valuable insights this evening for myself and for our audience. And you've also reminded us that there are many oft-forgotten details, important details to the discourse and the conflict that we all need to remind ourselves from time to time. So thank you for that. Thank you on behalf of the NJA for giving so generously of your time this evening. We reached out to you not long ago, and I want to say thank you too, whilst I'm offering some thanks to my colleague Dalia Hajioff, who both conceived the idea for this event this evening and also reached out to Professor Dershowitz. So thank you, Dalia. But back to you, Professor Dershowitz. Thank you very, very much for giving so generously of your time, your knowledge, doing it so graciously. You are, for all of us, a hero for Israel and for the Jewish community here in the UK and globally. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you to our audience for joining, and thank you for those who got to ask your questions. You put forward some excellent questions this evening, so thank you very much to everyone. And last but not least, to Daniel, who has been a very fantastic in conversation co-host with Professor Dershowitz this evening. Thank you, Daniel, for guiding the conversation so brilliantly, and guiding the valuable insight coming out of Professor Dershowitz. So thank you to both of you. And thank you to all of our audience, and back to you, Gary.
Yes, reiterate those thanks. Please watch this place. Please, please, please pay your £18 for life if you haven't done so already, because there's going to come a time when you might not get to be able to come to events like this, because we're going to limit them strictly to paid up members. We have nearly 800 members at the moment. I'm hoping to get to 1,000 in the near future and 2,000 in the next year or two. So, as I said, please join if you haven't. www.nja.org.uk. And thank you all very much, and have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you very much. And you now have 801 members, because I'm joining as well.
Thank you. Oh, wonderful.
Goodbye. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Professor.
Bye. Bye.
If you could send out how to join, I would appreciate it.
www.nja.org.uk.
I will send it to you. Thank you so much again. I will send it to you. And please send us the details of the pamphlet you were talking about. You show it to me.
10 Big Lies, and the name of the company that publishes it, you'll find it online, is Skyhorse Publishing. Skyhorse. And the name of the publisher is Tony Lyons. And if you just write to him and ask how many copies you need, they will be sent. No postage need, no nothing. You'll get it completely free of charge. As many give out. Good. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much again. Thank you.
You will. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.